Good afternoon and welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate for Barlow High School. Today we're going to be talking about the 1920s. We're going to be looking at the 1920s. They're often talked about as being roaring or reactionary, or maybe they were both. And there's that debate that's available. We'll have that debate actually in class, but for now we're going to look at aspects of the 20s being reactionary. So here we go. 20s, I'm going to claim in some ways is a reaction to progressivism. Progressivism, you see so much change happen in the 1900 to 1920 period of time, and then at the same time you're going to see people in the 1920s after World War I and after all this progressive change, some of it which is going beyond people's comfort zones, they are ready to move back to not having any reform and being kind of an isolationistic, anti-reform period. It's going to be coined the return to normalcy by Warren Harding, who wins the presidency in 1920. Okay, the Red Scare is our first thing we want to talk about. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution, I'm going to talk about communism versus capitalism, what the Communist Manifesto was, the communism of the Soviet Union. That's going to be a separate video, and that'll be available in conjunction with this chapter to kind of help people make sense of what's going on here. But that's not a subject for this video. I'm going to go into that with your next video. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 essentially is the time where the Bolsheviks, it's another name for people who are Marxists or communists, they come to power in Russia. They're going to coin it the Soviet Union, and they are going to be successful in taking over all of Russia, basically, and becoming the first country where the workers overthrow the rich, powerful class, the elites, and go down that road. Now, exactly what that means, you've read Animal Farm in class, so that gives you somewhat of an idea. This is like the animals tossing out the farmer, and yet at the same time, you're in a situation where these revolutions, as we will see, they never stay purely in the idea of the communists where it's this equal brotherhood. It always ends up in this totalitarian regime. That's a subject for another time. Now, this is one thing, and immediately President Wilson is going to send troops to help the opponents of the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks are anti-capitalist. The United States is capitalist. So when he does this, he's going to say to the Bolsheviks, basically, we don't want anything to do with you. The United States actually does not recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate nation until basically Franklin Roosevelt arrives on the scene during the Great Depression. So it's going to be a long time, okay? Several presidents come and go, and we still have no recognition of the Soviet Union. And these things are all going to be causes of some hostility later on between the United States and the Soviet Union that helps contribute to the Cold War. But the Red Scare is this. Not only did they have a revolution in 1917, but they start having this meeting called the Comintern, which stands for Communism International, and at this big worldwide conference of communists, they're going to announce in 1919 at the third annual Comintern that their goal is the worldwide overthrow of other styles of government, a worldwide takeover of communism, because that's what they ultimately believed was they would establish heaven on earth as this workers' paradise where all countries, the other governments would collapse and you would have this. So it's pretty natural for what they believe to say this, but how do you think that's going to be received by other countries, especially the United States? The leading capitalist country in the world at this time, they are not going to be receptive to it. Now, there's other factors that are going to lead to this Red Scare as well. But that's essentially what we're talking about. People freak out that the communists are going to try and take over America and overthrow it. And you're going to see some other circumstances going on that people start to say, this could happen. This could happen here. Strikes. In Seattle, you have a general strike that's going to occur, and it starts with the shipyard workers, and then it's going to spread to be, tons of workers in industry after industry throughout Seattle, and it's going to be very difficult to put down. It's the most widespread strike in a city that ever happens in United States history. It's going to get some people, even though it eventually falls, it is going to get some people. It evokes kind of this Bolshevik revolution. Well, what if all of Washington and Seattle were toppled? Could this spread? You're also going to have big strikes where they try and organize the steel industry. That'll eventually fail. And a United Mine Workers strike led by one of the two most important union individuals that there are, and that those are Samuel Gompers with the AFL. We've already talked about him. But then also John L. Lewis, who's the head of the miners, and he also, for 20th century union leaders, he's the other name to know for certain. Now, another thing that's a factor, so you have these widespread strikes that people fear might actually topple cities or governments or businesses, and they're threatening also some very significant, I mean, the steel industry is a massive, massive important industry at this time. The CPI is essentially the Committee for Public Information from World War I, and the Committee for Public Information was a propaganda machine that was out there designed to stop anyone from anti-Americanism. They were anti-foreigner. They're anti-German. They're essentially they're basically it's propaganda machine that's created by the government to just hammer the foreign parties, mainly the Germans, that are our opponents in World War I. Well, that has a carryover effect. During World War I, one of the things I talked about in the podcast, you have the anti any names such as Dachshund and Hamburger and all of these things, and beer's boycotted, and German composers are boycotted. Well, these feelings spread along with the Bolshevik Revolution. They kind of combine to create anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant, anti-foreign ideas, all of these feelings, and that really is what the Red Scare comes down to. It's what it is. The Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer is going to become a very powerful member in the government as the Attorney General when Woodrow Wilson is felled by a stroke and is basically not able to really do much, not going to be significantly as active as a president as he had been before that when he had his health. And so Mitchell Palmer, who had presidential aspirations himself for 1920, after his own home and many other businesses and some politicians' homes were bombed, he basically says we have to do something about these radicals. We've got the strikes, they're bombing people's homes now, and he takes this very personally after an attack on his own family, which thankfully no one was hurt. But the Palmer raids are basically going to prosecute tons of radicals. They're going to deport many communists and anarchists back to Eastern Europe and Russia. They're going to arrest many members of the IWW, the Wobblies, and essentially they're going to just do widespread persecution of kind of foreign ideas and foreign individuals who are advocating those ideas. And the most classic example of this, of course, is the Sacco and Vanzetti case. You have these Italian immigrants, they're anarchists, and there's circumstantial evidence connecting them to the murder of a government employee in Massachusetts. This circumstantial means, if you came and sat in my classroom, you would probably have fingerprints, maybe on the door or doorknob, certainly on a desk, I would hope. Maybe they would be able to find some of your hair fell out, or different things like that. Maybe you left a notebook in the room or a piece of paper you had touched. There would be some evidence that you had existed if you sent like a CSI team in to just find out everything in the room. Now, granted, that shows you were there. But if someone had killed me in my classroom, that wouldn't prove you did it necessarily. It just shows a connection to the scene of a crime, or maybe someone would have had a bad time and threatened somebody before, but there's no direct evidence showing that they actually did it. With O.J. Simpson case, with that situation, you had bloody gloves in his vehicle, and blood in his car, and blood in his house on his clothes, and all of this. That's a little bit more, and it was the victim's blood. They were able to connect that. He had a relationship to the victims. Those types of things. That's a little bit more of a direct, solid connection. Well, Sacco and Vanzetti, they had circumstantial evidence connecting them to the crime. Now, they actually have proven recently, forensically, what I've read is that they were able to show that Sacco and Vanzetti did, in fact, commit the murder. But at the time, some people still dispute that, but that seems to be forensically what people have settled on. At the time, though, they weren't convicted on solid evidence. They were convicted the jury was definitely prejudiced against them because of Red Scare feelings. They are Italian, they're anarchists, they're immigrants, and they kill an American, it was believed, and so this goes on and becomes a big situation, and they get executed for it. And a lot of people felt like they were executed because of who they were and what they represented, not firm evidence. And of course, that's not good if you're actually innocent. The KKK. The KKK resembled more at this time the know-nothings of the 1850s, which are anti-immigrant, nativist. They opposed all kinds of foreign groups and ideas. They opposed foreign competition. Then they were the 1860s and 70s kind of anti-black terrorist group, the civil rights era terrorist group in the 1950s, etc. They were more of that anti-immigrant group. Now, they certainly were anti-black, but they're also anti-Jewish, anti-foreigner, wanting stop to all immigration, and all of these other things like this. And with that being the case, the KKK, they're going to rise and swell in a lot of popularity. And you would think, well, of course, it's going to be in the South, but it's actually also throughout a lot of the Midwest, into Ohio and Indiana and a variety of other Midwestern states. Not very popular on the West Coast or in the extreme North, but it is going to be kind of this anti-immigrant group. When they have a guy who is convicted of assaulting a woman in Indiana, and they show that they kind of have a racketeering scheme to collect money. The KKK had millions of members and adherents to this anti-immigrant feeling. And it's an indication, just like this Red Scare, kind of phenomenon that's occurring. A lot of Americans had serious concerns about this and are wanting to get away from kind of like, these new ideas that they feel are pressing upon them, all of this change and radicalism and stuff like that. In addition to what was happening with progressivism. Immigration acts. Another way this is manifested, the KKK gets discredited in 1925 and kind of falls off the map again for a while. But the immigration acts, in the Immigration Act of 1921, and then followed up by the National Origins Act of 1924, these follow earlier immigration acts, such as the Emergency Quota Act, where they're going to basically put even smaller and smaller quotas on your population. So they say 3% and then 2% of your previous population that was already in the United States would be what the quota was for future. So this is really trying to stem the tide of massive immigration. And again, it's reflecting these anti-immigrant feelings, going back to World War I, going back to the Red Scare, all of these things. But they're trying to stem the flow of the immigrants, which have the new immigrants, which have massively come in between 1880s and the 1920s. So the Scopes monkey trial is another significant thing. This is a little bit different arena, but it kind of just shows this clash between new ideas and kind of more liberal or radical thinking, and very conservative, what they label as fundamentalist thinking. And this is a trial about evolution, of course, and whether it be taught in schools, and it was a controversial subject. And essentially what's going to happen is the teacher is going to get convicted and fined for teaching evolution in Tennessee, and then it's going to get overturned by a higher court. But it kind of just illustrates, it got national attention. People were very fired up. They had national political and legal figures going in to work on the case because everyone saw this as such a clash of culture and ideas in so many ways. Prohibition, of course, the 18th Amendment is one more example. Prohibition is, flat out, it's an attempt to finally realize what we talked about on the previous podcast with progressive reform, to say alcohol is a bad thing. It's responsible for so many problems: worker absenteeism, spousal abuse, fights, killings, alcohol-related deaths. Certainly not good for your health, and yet it's going to be dramatic. Prohibition is going to be, opposed by a lot of Americans, and that's a subject for a podcast. But you're going to see, temperance people had always been opposed by immigrants who liked their beer and did not agree with this. You're also going to see kind of the new upper class and middle class of society. Many of them are going to choose to flout this law, which will be definitely the subject of a future podcast. But that's all the time we have for today. Stay classy, Sam Barlow.